subtracted the dead from philosophical discussion, which, as we've seen, says Derrida. And secondly, the heteros, the Levinasian Derrida, the heteros, that puts a demand on me, which can never be reduced if you read Levinas seriously, to the order of the real. So he was worried that this was really evacuating the ethical relationship, which led him to do something kind of extreme, which is not speak to him again. In other words, never again address him.
Even though he would not well regard what he was doing as a democratization, like an absolute.
I'm not saying Derrida was fair, but I just thought the audience would be interested in why Derrida thought this was important enough that this one could not be addressed again.
There's lots of questions coming now from the floor. Question for you?
Alex, what you said about not knowing in advance. So Derrida's performativity, not knowing in advance how you might decide the relation between alteration and idealization. So we can never know in advance what that relation might. Right, and the more you try and decide in advance, the more you're going to do one or the other. You're going to privilege one at the expense of the other. But then, strangely, you made it seem as if Derrida could calculate this in advance, and that's how he can always undercut our expectations of him. So he can always be less than the radical we thought he was, and always more radical than we thought he could be. So this not knowing in advance, one of the things that I like about Derrida when I read him asking the question, wherein lies the distinction between, say, philosophy and literature, is that he doesn't decide in advance whether he's doing philosophy or doing literature when he asks that question. So it's as if he says, let's see where the distinction falls. I'm going to speak, and we'll see where this distinction falls, that between philosophy and literature, for example. And this performativity runs the risk of his being accused of not doing philosophy. He's doing literature, that's what the philosophers might say. He's doing literature. So he doesn't know in advance. But then, when I've always been struck by when he's interviewed, or when he's in front of the camera, he always says something like, well, I'm going to have to improvise. So now I don't know in advance. Now that I'm in front of the camera, now that I'm being interviewed, now that I'm being faced with this imperative, as it were, that I think you're alluding to when you talk about Cavell's passionate utterances, that I run the risk of being rebuked by you now. Now I'm going to have to improvise. As if there's a difference there in being in front of the camera and being interviewed to doing philosophy, to writing philosophy. And I wonder what that difference is. Now I don't know what I'm going to say. Or now I don't know differently than the way I didn't know what I was going to say when I was writing philosophy. So what is that difference? And then just one supplementary question. I don't know anything about Laruelle, but from your account of Laruelle, it seems to me that Laruelle will always know in advance what he's going to say. It's always going to be that he could only say the real, as you said, this kind of consistency. He seems to, from your account of him, seems to know in advance what he's going to say. And to that extent, there is no performativity, because there isn't that, well, let's see what's going to happen. Let's see whether it's real or not, as it were.
You want to start? Oh, just, yeah. I suppose he uses the word Gnosticism, which doesn't open itself to humility as a term, but it really is the opening gambit, it's the kind of opening decision that if I'm going to be a materialist, then I want to think about not just the form of thought as material, i.e. it is somehow correlated with the neurons of my brain or what have you, but rather that the content of thought, and philosophical thought included, is material and part of the material real. And what does that, and so what does that make of what looks like representations, which are about and transcend the real and or, you know, picture it and so on. So, on the one hand, there's that opening decision. Okay, here's a hypothesis. What follows if all the things that we as philosophers, thinkers are doing are part of the real, not about, but a part of the real. And when you do that then, that does open for him, after that point, places for experimentation. Because you experiment then with all the different philosophies that are out there and put them together, because they're all different parts of the real. Now this kind of language of part of the real, this mereological language, obviously could be, again, deconstructed, no doubt, and what do you mean part, whole, and so on and so on. But nonetheless, all these different philosophies that he experiments with and rewrites, but under immanence rather than transcendence, it leads to interesting effects. So he writes books that have amazing effects and different discussions of his new book that's just been, or a relatively new book, on theology, on the future Christ, that's just been translated. And so it leads to very strange effects for theologians to read about, in terms of taking theological theories and looking at them as material aspects, but they have, in their relationship, they are a part of the real in different ways, that is only discovered through the experiment of rewriting them under the sign of immanence. So there is some experimentation that is part of the performance, because what he is doing, the experimenting, is a performance as well. And when you get him in roundtables like this, he can be quite exasperating to talk to. But then sometimes you click, as in, because sometimes he's being clear, he's giving a clear illustration, and then you seem to get it, but then he goes too far and starts to all get muddy again. But then there's this third moment when you realize, actually, he's performing right now. He's actually practicing this right now in front of us. And what he's trying to do is to make us think the physicality of thought, almost, rather than the transparent referentiality of thought. So yeah, there is a sense in which his opening gambit is always the same, and therefore it's nothing new. But then, as it's played out, effects appear which are experimental and new, I would say. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I suppose that there's a rather simple answer, in a way. I think that Derrida was always extremely conscious of the context in which he was speaking. And because there is a context in which you speak, you know, a certain idealization, if you wish, certain expectations, certain norms, certain rules, certain conventions, and so on and so forth, you can, up to a point, negotiate and calculate what kind of effect you want to create, here rather than there. And I think that if you read him, even constantly, I mean, you know that, I don't have to point it out to you, he refers to this himself a lot, you know. That, you know, he's very conscious on how he speaks, what he says, how he puts what he's saying, depending on the context in which he appears. Although sometimes, you know, and this may have to do with this calculation or negotiation, he may do something completely unexpected. I remember, because some of the things I'm saying today seem to be very autobiographical, as it were, forgive me for that, but I remember how when he came to Frankfurt for the first time in 1983, and the paper he gave was the university in the eyes of its pupils, the thing that he had just done in Cornell, about the idea of the university precisely. This was the first time he was meeting Habermas officially, because Habermas had invited him to speak in Frankfurt. And what was the gift that Derrida brought Habermas? A copy of Glas in French. So this is really where you can see that, you know, sometimes he could misbehave. And he knew how to, you know, use negotiations or calculations of the context to something unexpected. But on the other hand, then, having said all of this, the question is the question of improvisation, yes? Mm-hmm. I always felt that that's where you wanted to have him. Because, of course, you know, I can remember endless seminars and workshops, and I'm sure Drucilla can as well, where he would repeat something you had heard 1,000 100